So I recorded this earlier, but apparently I needed to add myself to the stage. But I do think it's important to create an epilogue here to the last video, episode 9, the video essay. There's a period we're looking at here, 1864 to 1908, right? Where my main argument is that Cuba is the hotbed, the ground, the foundation, and the soil for baseball's modernity. It's not America; it's happening in Cuba, right? And so I kind of just want to talk over the dynamic that's happening here. I think specifically around slavery, liberation, and how the both of the professional major leagues in both nations, Cuba and the United States, structured themselves in a response to slavery, right, and a response to the liberation movement. Um, what I have here, it looks like my connection's a little spotty, but what I have here is kind of just like a diagram and an idea to discuss, right? Which is based around both of the liberation movements occurring in these countries at the same time. You have the Civil War and the liberation of Cuban slaves, um, halfway between the inciting of the revolutionary fervor in the 1850s and 60s into the Spanish American War and the liberation of Cuba into the 1900s, right? Which then results in Cuba in an integration of the Professional Baseball League. Um, how to kind of go about this is that you have the Civil War that happens mid-century in America, and the response to the Civil War, right, and the liberation of black slaves in the South is a reactionary one, right? Baseball becomes the rules themselves in terms of segregation become reified in the latter part of the century. Black players are pushed out of the league entirely, right? Um, you have alongside the developments of the Civil War, you have the informal professional baseball league begins to become codified in 1857 with the Knickerbocker Club. Um, you have this sort of mythology of civic national unity, which is really under this singular codified exclusionary segregationist policy, which is applied to baseball and is obviously a fundamental part of the civilizational fabric at large of the United States, right? Which ultimately comes to a head in the integration with Jackie Robinson, the 50s and the 60s, the civil rights movements of the time in the United States. There is this, it becomes, I mean, it's so interesting how the myth of baseball functions in America because it's so patently exclusionary. And you kind of, you look at what's going on in Cuba from 1850 to 1900. You look at this radical revolutionary movement that's it's almost simultaneous with the Civil War in the United States, which is fascinating. There's really only a decade or two that separate them. Um, you have this liberation of the slaves, and then in the Cuban War, right, the Cuban Revolutionary War against the Spanish colonial regime, um, you it's sort of a throwing off the chains of this regime that created a very racially classed society, which is reflected directly and immediately in how the game of baseball is played and functions in Cuba. And as soon really as the Spanish American War ends and Cuba becomes a sovereign state, a sovereign nation, the Cuban League integrates. They're signing Black Cuban and U.S. players in the early 1900s, right between 1900 and 1910. There's an influx of the absolute best that the Black American baseball game has to offer in coalition with Black Cuban players, creating a full spectrum integrated professional league for the first time in baseball history. It's hard to overstate this, right? Because you have this sort of exclusionary nationalist myth of baseball being totally American and all of its revolutions and innovations occur in America. I'm sure there are offshoots in Cuba or Venezuela, what have you, or Japan, but you're seriously missing the point of the real cause and kind of radical revolutionary modernity that's created first in Cuba you feel the shocks that happen with it in the United States with the federal league, which is labor disputes in terms of how players should be paid, how much they should be paid, leading right up into World War I, which is a severe shakeup of the United States' image of itself. Right, it's a nation for the first time entering into the world scene in a big way. Um, you have that going on simultaneous to America's industrialization. That's a really important aspect of deadball, and that was kind of primarily previously my main sphere of inquiry. But then when I got more and more into Rube Foster, I mean, I knew this was an important figure, but I'm just kind of understanding now how important, specifically based on this Cuba Integrationist League, the Cuban Integrationist League. You have total segregation of black players from the late 1800s all the way up until 1947 with Jackie Robinson in the professional league in the United States. Meanwhile, you have, I mean, multiple revolutions that happen in Cuba, as I discussed in the last video, over the span of just a couple of decades that occur alongside and along with as a sort of ecosystem of the nation of Cuba. It's fast emerging professional baseball league, which has significant gravitas and skill. But again, right, it's not fully integrated. This is still a classist, racist league that is exclusionary under the Spanish colonial regime. This rapidly changes, and I can't overstate the importance of Emilio Saborin, right, the Havana player who helped establish the Havana Club, but also plays an instrumental role in the national revolutionary mythos in the Cuban National War against Spain. He acts as an agitator and ultimately becomes imprisoned in this scandal of stealing ammunition from the Spanish regime, and he dies in a Spanish prison in North Africa. Right? We discussed this in the last video. The development of baseball in Cuba, and I think this directly contributes to the immediate desegregation of the league upon Cuban independence, is based in a radical revolutionary mode of thinking, which is the reclamation and establishment of the Cuban national native mythic identity, away and apart from the Spanish colonial rule, which again was so steeped in a caste race-based system of power, right? Which was how the Spanish minority maintained their power in a native Cuba. It's just like a radically different mode between the United States and Cuba in terms of where they are in their national identity, how the nation views itself and is crafting and sculpting its myth. I mean, obviously, this white exclusionary segregationist myth in the United States, so much of it comes back to baseball as the national pastime and the culture. And you look at that, it's trying to declare itself the first and foremost professional baseball league in the world, right? Baseball's born in the U.S., so surely the U.S.'s baseball league must be the greatest. But we just see that this is patently untrue. You have, I believe, in 1914 or the early 1910s, the pennant-winning Philadelphia Athletics come and play, right? As well as the Reds come and play in 1908. You have these American professional baseball teams that actually come to Cuba. Some of them came in the late 1800s, and I'll tell you the difference. The late 1800s, there was really no competition. I mean, the U.S. professional teams outclassed the Cuban teams, really entirely due to this mutually segregationist policy, right? But then you have the U.S. professional teams come back in post-integration to Cuba, and they face up against these Cuban teams that are integrated with some of the best black baseball players, bar none, not only from the region, but from the United States of America, who go down there to play with these fully integrated Cuban teams. And they're embarrassed. I think Ban Johnson actually came up with, it was like basically a ruling that said, listen, you're not supposed to go down there and play these teams anymore because they're integrated, quote unquote. But you have supposedly the foremost professional league internationally, the Major League Baseball in the United States of America, the professional league at large, is going down to Cuba to play these integrated teams, and they're losing, right? So this is something that has to be cut off and removed from the circuit because it tells kind of tells on the American myth that this segregationist policy is not only not necessary, but it's actively detrimental because you're losing some of all of really the absolute best that America has to offer in black baseball because they're going down to Cuba to play. And then obviously, as I stated in the last video, 1908, you have that really powerful photo of the Havana team, which I have pictured here. This is a little bit of a later rendition of the Havana team with Rube Foster, right? Pete Hill and Home Run Johnson. And this is where, to me, again, my kind of speculation or my vision is that he goes down there, experiences this radically integrated, extremely well-organized league, right? Bear in mind, this Cuban league had over, half a century to become a highly organized, powerful, generative ecosystem of professional baseball. And it happens very quickly. It almost happens alongside the U.S. I mean, obviously further behind because they're introduced to baseball as the United States is becoming very organized. But they organize very quickly. That professional league with the institution of the Havana team gets organized very fast. Within a couple of decades, they're up and running, and they're having these major baseball events among the three major teams. So you can see, right, as a colonial liberation project, this Cuban national identity emerges at the outset of the 1900s and immediately declares itself through this radical integrationist policy in baseball, as well as again in the freed slaves that happened just 15 or 25 years before 1900 hits. And you see their approach to the end of slavery in the institution of the Cuban free nation is radically different than the United States' approach to the end of slavery, right? There's this deeply conservative reactionary movement to enclose baseball in a very narrow window of who and what is allowed to play baseball, when, why, etc. This exclusionary policy, right, is under the guise of maintaining the character and the essence of the sport. I mean, whatever words you want to use, but in reality, what it does is there's this retreat into a national myth that is a closed-mindedness that must be protected, right? This kind of mythological dream state of American baseball as being pure or highly advanced or evolved must be protected from what really is the radical threat of this Cuban integrated league. You have the best players in Cuba across the entire racial and ethnic spectrum, as well as the movement of black players who are being barred from United States baseball down into Cuba to play on these teams. You're assembling a hemispheric kind of power of great baseball. And again, right, I can only imagine watching some of these games because of just how fantastic these players were, right? And this is something that actually accelerates into the 20s and 30s, alongside the huge boom of the myth of baseball and the legend of baseball, due to press photography and enhanced media technology in the United States. So, I think I've summed this up pretty clearly. Is that we discussed this in the last video, the trajectory of the birth of Cuban baseball is one that is so steeped in this revolutionary, anti-slavery, reclamation of national sovereignty instinct and impulse, which is the political and cultural impulse of the time. And this is something that's directly reflected in their the political policy of baseball, how it's conducted the moment that liberation is achieved. And you see this tension all through the latter half of the 19th century in Cuba, where there's the Spanish colonial government has to be appeased, but what the Spanish colonial government observes, and this is well documented, is that baseball is a threat because it becomes this almost indelible part of what represents the Cuban national native impulse. Which is fascinating, right? I mean, this is a sport that's been adopted from the United States, right? The founder, Guio, he comes back from Alabama, going to school there in the middle of the 1800s during the Civil War. He brings this sport back to Cuba, and it becomes adopted as a sort of primordial national mythology that begins to create a distinguishment between the emerging modern nationally sovereign Cuba from the Spanish colonial government. And the Spanish colonial government observes this as a threat, right? And so they're trying to prevent it, but at the same time, they can't because it's such a massive movement that too much restriction, right, it poses the threat of violence and conflict, which inevitably emerges just due to the nature of the climbing, intensifying revolutionary state of Cuba at the time. And through that, obviously, I mean, you get this at the really just as 1900 hits, you have the first professional integrated baseball league that happens 50 years before Jackie Robinson. And I mean, that's just one player. Then you get Larry Doby, you get Minnie Minoso, right? You get these players that slowly begin to integrate quote unquote white baseball in the United States of America. This is the real state of baseball at the time. And it's Cuba, right? It's happening through Cuba and it's happening in Cuba. Let me think if I need to discuss anything else. I don't, but I just want to kind of reiterate. You have these abolitions of slavery that occur almost simultaneously historically, America and Cuba, right? These are abolitions of slavery occurring in real time, parallel. I mean, just hundreds, if not thousands of miles apart. I mean, really, right? The proximity is insane. But the difference is America's national liberation movement, if you want to call it that, in terms of the Revolutionary War, is a century prior, whereas the national liberation movement in Cuba is occurring simultaneous to the anti-slavery and abolition movement that inevitably becomes enacted. So you have this almost redoubled revolutionary fervor. It's a national freedom as well as a racial freedom, right? Through the abolition of slavery and a reconstitution of how the social and cultural order functions in Cuba at this period of time. 50 years. It's happening, bam, simultaneous. Whereas the American social order, right? I mean, obviously, post the Revolutionary War, you have the development of the cultivation of, I mean, in further intensifying slavery, right, in the United States of America, and this very well kind of reified social and cultural system, which depends on this segregationist, okay, you're not slaves anymore, but you're second-class citizens and you don't receive the same rights, you can't participate in the same social and cultural institutions post-Civil War, right? So you have this country that really, in large part, socially, economically, culturally, and politically, at the very least in the South, but obviously as well in the North, right? Because this is an interconnected ecosystem of economics, is dependent upon slave labor for the foundations of its economy, right? I mean, plantation slave labor. And so you have this illusion which must be cultivated and reaffirmed in terms of the social construct of who is allowed to do what, where, when, and why. And this obviously is going to include the national pastime of baseball itself. It's a necessary myth that the United States has to tell itself to remain in the place it remains, which is a destructive, kind of toxic, violent social atmosphere based on exclusion, segregation, and racism. So you have this going on, right? The United States emerges from the Revolutionary War, and it immediately, right? It's just delusional. I mean, the Constitution of the United States is obviously not in context when it comes to slavery at all, right? It's an illusion that's continuing as a part of a emerging national mythos, and you see that just being clearly represented in the segregationist policies of baseball, whereas the national mythos of Cuba in this again double way, both through the national liberation movement as well as the abolition of slavery movement, which are occurring simultaneous, that revolutionary fervor is a radical reconstruction of Cuban identity through a stripping of the shackles of the colonial government again, and a development of a national identity as well as a racial identity simultaneously. I don't think that can be understated, because in the United States, this development is stratified, right? You still have all of the racial segregationist problems upon the signing of the Constitution. Um, in terms of the Revolutionary War, you have all of those problems, and they just continue because they're not really addressed at all. And then you have the Civil War, and you still have the economic, social, and cultural problems, even though slavery has been addressed, at least in a kind of we do not have slaves anymore kind of way, right? But there's the cultural, kind of social, religious sentiments of the nation, right? Are by no means rectified, right? This is still a continuing segregationist policy. I mean, for as long as I think the United States can remember or conceive, right? This is something that still has not been addressed and is at the foundation of the national cultural identity. So it's fascinating to see this in Cuba, because what it tells us and what it shows us through the lens of baseball is a emerging national identity, which is radical for the time, and breaking away from this Spanish colonial regime and instituting a radically inclusive policy, which extends to baseball, and through baseball mirrors the national intent of what is to happen upon the abolition of slavery in Cuba. Because again, right, baseball emerges and is emerging throughout the 1800s and into the 1900s as a large part of the Cuban national identity. I mean, you have photos of the greatest figures. I mean, I think Castro was a baseball player, right? I mean, this is a large part of the brew of the Cuban national identity as it emerges out from under the Spanish colonial rule. So that will do it for the epilogue here. I will get this up. I think it's episode 10. I made a post in the posts community section, just kind of going over some details of some of the other stuff that was discussed in episode 9, and just kind of putting it to text, especially regarding archival materials and artifacts and how they function, I think specifically in Cuba and Venezuela. Great talking with you here. I hope to see you on the next one. Catch you later.